welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Green, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WMYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. I'm very, very pleased to have with me on the telephone this evening, Andrea Ritchie. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you.
Well, it's an honor to speak with you. And I looked at all of the work you've done. In reading your book, I realized how multifaceted your jobs are, your tasks are. And let me just introduce the audience to you, share your background. Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant and police misconduct attorney and organizer who is engaged in extensive research, writing, and advocacy around criminalization of women and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT people of color over the past 2 decades. And her recent publication is Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. It's now available from Beacon Press. Andrea Ritchie is a nationally recognized expert and sought-after commentator on policing issues, and she's testified before a number of task force on 21st century policing, the White House Council on Women and Girls, the Prison Rape Elimination Commission, and several United Nations treaty bodies. Her book, her book before this is Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women. She is the co-author of that book. And as I said earlier, you've been doing this work for quite some time. I can see you're very, very passionate about it.
I definitely am. I think one might even say somewhat singularly focused. I've been working on this issue for, as you mentioned, what I just realized when I was writing the book was over 2 decades, and I have had the privilege of also collaborating with other people in writing another book called Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States, and also the Say Her Name report that you mentioned. I had the privilege of collaborating with Professor Kimberly Crenshaw on that one at the African American Policy Forum. So it's been a journey sort of on my own and with others to what has culminated in what's in Invisible No More. So it's been a long and hard, but also really satisfying journey.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to bring together all that you've acquired, all of your experiences and your knowledge. And your book is just so comprehensive, so deeply researched, and you just bring in not only the stories of the women, but the scholarship and the research and the examples. I'm just really, really impressed by it. So
much. That means a lot coming from someone who is the director of a writing program. I think sometimes those of us who are activists and sort of organizers feel a little bit like I feel a little bit like an imposter in the world of authors and writers because it's a craft I've learned and sort of picked up as I've been doing the work. So it means a lot to hear that from you.
Well, you're welcome. I think what ends up happening, from my perspective, I see many kinds of books. As you know, people are creating fiction and poetry and the essays. And what happens in a book like this is not a book that you can sit down and read through one reading. It's a book that reminds you of why it's important to do this work, and something you can go back to and research. In fact, I could see even sharing with my students portions of this book. I teach African American literature, early African American literature, and just your work on the slave codes, the historical record around the criminalization of women, I think is really fascinating and important to know. So I'd like you to start by giving us your motivation for writing this book. Why did you feel it was important? You've been doing this work a long time. What was the motivation for writing this?
I mean, I think it's in a large part what you just described, which is creating a resource for storytellers, for media makers, for organizers, for members of the general public who are looking for a way to understand or make sense of individual stories that might come to light, whether it's Shakisha Clemens' arrest at the Waffle House recently for basically asking for the manager's number, and her really brutal and sexually degrading mistreatment by the police in Saraland, Alabama, but then also how then she later came to be charged with assault when it was so clear from the videotape that she was the one who was being assaulted by police officers, or Sandra Bland's case, which sort of burst onto the national consciousness in July of 2015 in the middle of the summer of sort of conversation and organizing and outrage around police violence. It's to help folks put those kinds of stories and incidents into a broader historical context, as you mentioned, in terms of the history of state violence against Black women from slavery to the present, and to sort of see it as part of a larger spectrum of gender-based violence as well, and sort of show how state violence and community-based violence against Black women play off each other and also contribute to the invisibility of Black women as sort of targets of police violence. So the idea was to tell the stories, to lift up the names, to try and breathe life into our understanding of the women who this happens to, because often all we see is sort of a 15 seconds of a video of something that happened, like at the Waffle House, or we read a snippet in a newspaper, and to sort of breathe some life into those stories and help us to see the women that the violence happened to as full beings and their families, and the ways in which people in their lives who loved them, cared for them, perceived them, and experienced them, and then to then put those stories into sort of the context of the research that's out there, the information that's out there, and the trends over time, so that we could start to see that this isn't just one set of bad cops in Saraland, Alabama. It wasn't just one bad cop who pulled Sandra Bland over. It's not just it happens to be a rash of, Black women being, having the police called on them for napping while Black, golfing while Black, asking for the manager's number while Black, breathing while Black, right? But that actually this is part of how Black women's bodies and presence and in public, and also any protest of mistreatment or discrimination is treated and responded to by police and the state. So the goal was really to sort of gather together everything I had learned from women who had experienced police violence, from reading, from research, from litigating, from the people who have been honored and privileged to have them share their stories with me, and put it all together into a resource that people could, as you say, go back to, use, look up, and use to make sense of this problem, but also to then go beyond the question of making Black women's experiences of policing visible into having them be part of what shapes our understanding of the problem and therefore of the solution.
Right, and the timing for this could not be better. How has the book been received?
It's been interesting. The book has been well received, and I have to say, every time I speak and, a Black woman comes up to me, or a Black girl comes up to me and at the end and says, I'm so grateful to you for writing this book, for making these stories visible. That's who I wrote the book for. So I feel that reception has been so warm, so gracious, so generous, and I'm so grateful for that. And it's been well sort of publicized in particularly online media and PR and so forth. At the same time, sort of mainstream media has not. Sort of the what I talk about in the book is also kind of what's happened in how the book has been received in the world, which is that it just doesn't get perceived as a conversation or a book about policing, because it's looking at the issues of racial profiling and policing and mass incarceration through the lens of women's experiences. So somehow that doesn't get perceived to be a valid standpoint or a universal standpoint, or one that is broad enough to merit conversation, to merit being part of a larger conversation around policing. It's been sort of interesting to watch kind of the patterns I talk about in the book also kind of manifest in how the book is perceived. But I definitely am grateful for all of the coverage it's gotten, and the people like yourself who have made sure that there's a conversation around it, and that's part of the conversation. And I think things are starting to shift as a result.
I think they're starting to shift, but I think what you've discussed just reinforces how the fact that we still have a long way to go. There's still so many people who are silent, and you bring up in several instances in the book where, and as you just said, where people are just pleased to or grateful to at least have their voices be heard. And this is a structural problem, as we will discuss that a little bit more. But I'd like you to provide our audience with a sense of the historical context for this. You spent some time talking about how this is rooted in colonial violence and the codes, the slave codes, the black codes, the Jim Crow codes.
Definitely. There is sort of been some silence, although thanks to scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp and, of course, Angela Davis and many others who have written about black women's experiences of slavery, generally speaking, the sort of structural sexual violence that was embedded and inherent to and essential to slavery, and the structural physical violence and the kinds of punishment and policing and cruelty to black mothers and the sort of narratives about black mothers that emerge from slavery are really important to look at, because they are, frankly, what still shapes police interactions with black women today. There were a number of narratives constructed around black women during slavery, as I'm sure many of your listeners are well aware, around, justifying systemic rape of black women to produce a larger enslaved population by claiming that black women were inherently sexually deviant and promiscuous and sort of under this Jezebel narrative, and that black women, because of high rates of infant mortality, because black women were having children under conditions that were horrific, malnourishment, or being worked from sun up to sundown, et cetera, having high rates of infant mortality, being framed as bad mothers or uncaring mothers in order to justify ripping their children from them to sell them away. And so forth, that, there were these perceptions that black women don't experience pain, which would then justify experimentation on enslaved black women, or any number of perceptions that black women were inherently threatening and dangerous and devious, which sort of were a manifestation of, slave owners' fears of what black women who were working in their house and taking care of their families and children might do, because they, somewhere in their hearts, knew that what they were doing to black women was inhuman, and they rightly feared that black women would rise up and retaliate. And so those perceptions are what make police officers, sort of have transcended time, have evolved over time. They've turned into the welfare queen narrative, or as Patricia Hill Collins talks about, the hoochie mama narrative. But all of these narratives about black women that lead police officers to perceive them in much the same way and to react to them in much the same way, so that black women, no matter what they're doing, are always perceived, it seems, by police officers as a threat, as inherently kind of deranged and dangerous, and that contributes to police violence, including fatal police violence. In fact, a study recently came out of the University of Washington that showed that if you look at the instances of fatal shootings of black women are the only group for whom the majority of those shootings take place when they're unarmed. So in fact, black women are most likely to be falsely perceived as a threat by police officers than any other group, including black men. And that's rooted in these same narratives of black women as dangerous and threatening and inherently violent, no matter whether they're in need of help, no matter whether they're in a situation where they pose no threat under any circumstance. Those perceptions can prove fatal to black women. And so, and then, the policing of prostitution statistics will make it clear in New York City, 84% of prostitution arrests are of black or Latina women. And that's rooted in perceptions of both groups as inherently sexually deviant, promiscuous, and likely to be engaged in prostitution.
Right, and you of course make the connection between other women of color, Latinos, Native Americans, transgender. You make that connection of the way.
I do, and And it was a bit of a struggle when I was writing, because as you point out, there's like so much material, and the book is so dense and full, and at one point it was many more pages long until my publisher said that's just
you have to let it go. Let it go. Huh?
Exactly. We're not going to publish a 600-page book, but it felt there were times I was like, I'm just going to write a book about Black women and girls. That's the community that I'm from. That's the community that I work with. It's what I'm most familiar with. But it felt important because there are so many points of potential solidarity, of shared work, because even though the origins and the narratives that drive the perceptions of Black and Latina women, or Black and Native women, or Black trans women and non-trans women might be somewhat different or rooted in different structures, whether it's colonialism or slavery or genocide, but ultimately they manifest sometimes in very similar ways, and that's a potential point for us to connect, to build together, to heal together, and to organize together. So it felt important to at least try to show where those areas of connection were. And I learned a lot in doing that about where and how many points of similarity there are across race and gender identities and sexualities in terms of how police lines of gender and enforce sort of racialized notions of women of color.
Right. Now you zero in on some particular areas: the war on drugs, the broken windows policy, the immigration enforcement, the school to prison pipeline. Would you want to just highlight and give us examples of those? You've integrated it in your conversation, but you spend a great amount of time really giving examples and zeroing in on the current policing practices where you see women discriminated against and made invisible. So
definitely, I think that the war on drugs is the area in which I think we're most familiar with Black women's experience. In the
yes.
In the late 90s, there was, I'm sure you remember the sort of national conversation about Black women being searched and strip searched and
yes.
cavity searched at airports across the country, O'Hare in particular, and in Florida, in Miami, and that behavior is still going on. It just is no longer the subject of national conversation, right? And the war on drugs is still the primary driver of the fact that women remain the fastest growing prison population and have been over the past 4 decades, which is a little known fact, but one that should also drive our conversations about mass incarceration. So a third of people in federal prison and in jails, of women in federal prisons and in jails, are there on drug offenses. And they're there because the way in which the war on drugs is waged targets low-level users and sellers. And like in any other industry, Black women are at the bottom rungs of the industry. They are the low-level users and sellers, often selling to, because they're being compelled to by someone in their life, or just, because they are economic necessity, or to support their use, or any combination of those things. And I think that's a particular concern right now, because the current Attorney General has declared a return and a ramping up of those tactics of targeting indiscriminately people at the low end in the hopes that they will give information about people, higher up. But the fact is, Black women have very little power in the drug trade, generally speaking, and therefore have no information to trade. And that's why they end up doing much longer sentences, 25, 30 years, 40 years life sentences for first-time minor nonviolent offenses, because they're unable to trade information, whereas the people who supposedly the war on drugs is targeting, the kingpins, the traffickers, are able to get away with much smaller sentences because they have lots of information to trade. And then there's the kinds of those searches that happen at the airports also happen on street corners and in houses and in communities on an alarming basis. That police officers will just walk up to women and tell them to lift up their shirts to prove they're not hiding drugs, or open up their pants to prove they're not hiding drugs, or subject them to public strip searches or cavity searches in full view of the public, ostensibly to look for drugs. And so that is a kind of tactic of the war on drugs and a kind of police violence that doesn't get documented in those numbers of who's incarcerated and who winds up in a jail cell, because in many cases that doesn't end up in incarceration. It just ends up in a violation of Black women's bodies. That's routine and part of this war. So that is one sort of main part of the conversation. Broken windows policing, as many people in New York City know, is about targeted policing of low-level offenses, generally speaking in public spaces, and generally speaking ones that low-income people or homeless people have no choice but to engage in because they live and exist in public spaces, or that are very subjective, like disorderly conduct, right? And that then brings in those perceptions that I was talking about that are rooted in slavery, that black women are inherently always out of order, right? Like if they're not behaving as mammy, then inherently are seen as out of order or inherently seen as, for instance, being engaged in prostitution. And broken windows policing gives police officers the tools to act on those perceptions and lead to those disproportionate arrests of black women. So in New York City, 80% of women who are arrested are black or Latina for anything, including those low-level offenses. And that's rooted in those perceptions. You could see a black woman and a white woman doing the exact same thing on a street corner, but those perceptions mean that a black woman is going to be perceived to be disorderly, to be too loud, to be making unreasonable noise. A police officer is more likely to go look in her purse and see if he can find some drugs or condoms and then charge her with being involved in prostitution as a result. And the very same thing a white woman could be doing, and the police officer wouldn't even see her or pay attention. So the broken windows policing give police officers tools to engage in that kind of discriminatory policing. And then, immigration enforcement, I think we forget that black women are, in fact, a very significantly growing part of the population of immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean, and are therefore very much being targeted by the intensified immigration policing that's going on right now and the violence that attends to that. And similarly, for the War on Terror, the book, for instance, tells the story of Adama Ba, who's a Muslim woman who, or at the time was a girl, shortly after 9/11, who was rounded up and taken and held away from her parents in a facility and interrogated for a long period of time on the suspicion of terrorism, which proved, of course, to be baseless. But meanwhile, she very much shifted and changed the course of her life. And so I think it's sort of, the book looks where we're already looking at things like the war on drugs or broken windows policing or Islamophobic policing or immigration enforcement, and finds the stories of black women in there and finds how they're similar to and different from the stories of black men.
Right. Well, you do. There is hope. You have in many of the chapters a section on resistance. How do we resist this? What can we do to address this and solve this? Yeah.
There's people organizing around individual people's cases. So, for instance, there's people organizing for justice in the case of Shakisha Clemens. They just had a march in Saraland, Alabama, and people demanding justice in the case of DeCynthia Clemens, who was killed by police outside of Chicago in March of this year. So people do organize around individual cases, and then others organize to sort of address the systemic issues that drive those individual cases, right? So to get rid of those laws that police officers can use in a discriminatory way in order to target black and brown women. So, for instance, in New York City, the Legal Aid Society has sued to strike down the loitering for purposes of prostitution statute, and there's a move in Albany as well to repeal the statute. And it's because loitering for the purposes of prostitution just means standing around and intending to engage in prostitution. How you know what someone's intent is when they're standing around is purely a matter of profiling, and the lawsuit and the efforts to change the law at the state level both point that out, and that results in discriminatory enforcement against black women. So people are tackling it individually and systemically. And I do want to lift up the fact that the organization Black Youth Project 100 has called a National Week of Action for June 11th to 16th around ending all forms of violence against black women, including state violence. And this I describe in the book. They did 2 previous national days of action around this, which were really an effort to sort of bring those individual cases and those local campaigns together and weave them into sort of a tapestry to show that this work has been going on in many forms and ways across the country for many, many decades, but to make it kind of visible within the larger movements against police violence and the larger movements against gender-based violence. So people are coming together to hold many different kinds of events, panel discussions, vigils, direct actions, healing circles, and so forth during that week. And so I encourage people to go to their website and check it out and see if there's a way they can join in, even if it's just having a conversation around your kitchen table with 5 of your friends about what you do know about police violence against black women and girls, what you don't know, and how you're going to sort of shift the way you relate to those issues in order to make more room for those stories and that kind of resistance.
Right. And what do you say? We're coming to a close. What do you say to the people, I'm sure you've gotten this, who say it's not as relevant, it's not as prevalent as you're saying, that you're just pushing all of this and putting it together? How do you respond to that? In other words, how do you really raise the consciousness? You talked about the organizing, but how do you raise the consciousness among people, individual people?
Sure. I mean, one, I just want to point out that there's a book website, invisiblenomorebook.com, and there's a few things on there that I point people to. One is a study guide that people can use to have these conversations, and that has fact sheets that sort of show that it's not me who's coming up with these facts. There are researchers, academics, many of them former law enforcement officers who are researching these issues, particularly when it comes to police sexual violence. All the research done in that area is by current or former law enforcement officers. So I'm not pushing it; they're documenting it themselves. So I encourage people to look at the study guide and resources there to sort of have those kinds of critical conversations with each other. There's also a database on the website, and the database I created in part because I couldn't write a 600-page book, or at least publish one. And every time I had to cut a case, it sort of broke my heart. I felt like, does this mean now it's going back into, the realm of oblivion in this box in my apartment, and it lives on in the heart of the woman it happened to and the people who know her, and this box, and nowhere else in the world. And so I created the database, which includes cases that are in the book, but also cases that didn't make it in. There's currently 456 entries there. That's not all the cases of police violence against Black women and women of color. It's just the ones that happen to be in there at this moment. So I think that's my response, is that,
Okay, we are at our close. I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off, but I want to thank you for you say in your conclusion, you can't offer all the answers to these questions, but you're pushing new conversations forward.
Exactly. So that's the goal.
That's the goal. So I thank you for doing this. I encourage our listeners to go to the website of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, with Andrea Ritchie. And I thank you for doing this work, this very, very critical, important work, and for making the stories and the experiences of Black women and women of color visible. Thank you so much for this conversation.
And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and you have been listening to Writers on Writing with your host, Dr. Brenda Green, Executive Director, the Center for Black Literature. And I want to thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson. And remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu. Thank you.
Inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers. And we call this song, I've Known Rivers.